This is Book 6 in the Forest of the Edge series, titled Flight of the Wounded Falcon. Written by Trish Mercer, published by Trish Mercer, and read by Trish Mercer. Surprise! We will begin. Chapter 1. Young Pear is an interesting young man. Year 363. General Lemuel Thorn straightened his already erect back and reviewed the next 200 troops that paraded before him. He stood on the crest of a man-made hill that crushed an old barn to overlook the parade grounds that were once a farm. The farmhouse had been demolished to make room for the large mess hall that stood near the new main gates of the expanded compound. The first thing soldiers want when they return from maneuvers is a meal. Thorn knew how to treat his men. It was one of the reasons they were so loyal to him. He quickly calculated how many more troops were to come. 2,000 now had already passed him, and 5,000 still needed to go by in celebration of his 25th year as commander of Province 8 and the surrounding areas. Some older history books said that Administrator Commandant Genève had been in charge of the fort for 2 of those years. But Thorn had disposed of those books as easily as he disposed of Genève. And now no one remembered the old administrator or his time in the village that used to be known as Edge of the World. It was as if he had never existed. The sun beat down exceptionally warm for the 35th day of planting season, but at least it wasn't pouring rain as it had been for the past 3 celebrations. Already, the retelling of Thorn's defeat of the impotent colonel, his traitorous wife, the sergeant major spy, and the loss of the children 25 years ago had been recounted by a major in a loud and dramatic voice, complete with reenactments by troops in appropriate costumes. Special emphasis was given to the fact that their general had been only a captain at the time, received a crippling injury, yet continued on to defeat all those who destroyed their peace. Only through General Thorn's tenacity and perseverance did he eventually overthrow the commandants themselves, who caused so much chaos which still plagued their splintered world. The speech had been honed for years to motivate the young troops to feats of their own glories, despite hardship and pain. The greatest moment of the celebration would be when General Thorn would draw his sword and remind the men of the growing threat to the other sectors, and how for years Edge, now Province 8, had been the most peaceful in the entire world because of the strong army presence. The future of their area, he would remind them, and indeed of the entire world, depended on General Thorn and his men maintaining peace against the rest of the world that no longer knew order. But past the gates of Fort Shin, where General Thorn stood, through the forest littered with scalding waterspouts, deadly gas pockets, and lethal mud volcanoes, beyond the boulder field that could take a full day or more for the average man to scale, up the rocky ridges and slopes of the great and impassable mountains, past the high mountain meadows no one in the known world knew existed, through narrow and confusing canyons that swallowed many stray cattle, and beyond a narrow passageway opened up a valley of immense proportions. And in that valley grew wildflowers, animals, gardens, crops, orchards, vineyards, herds, and a civilization that kept itself unknown and hidden from the world. To the south and west of that main city stood a building designated for the education of older teenagers, and toward that building another general was jogging in a hurry and wondering if this time he'd be too late to prevent a catastrophe. Had he lived in the known world, he would have been forced into retirement 2 years ago. But the only ones who retired here were those who were infirm or dying. This general was neither. While he wasn't quite as brawny as he'd been as a younger officer, he was still as fit as men a third of his age. The only way anyone could keep him down was to pile a mountain on top of him. He had far too many responsibilities, and the men in the towers had just signaled to him that the greatest concern of his life was currently standing on top of a 2-level building, having hatched yet another less than brilliant plan. His grandson was ready to fly. Young Perrin Shin, named after his grandfather, stood on top of the 2-story high schoolhouse and wondered if the wind would affect his attempt. The breeze was only slight, but it could interfere. Then again, a stronger wind may have been better. Well, he'd find out soon enough. That was the purpose of today's test. "You're going to get in trouble," whined the voice of a cousin far below. Everyone had an opinion, and he'd learned long ago to disregard them because they were usually wrong. At 17 years old, he'd pretty much figured out everything already. Young Per wriggled his back to straighten out his wings, or rather the blanket strapped to the poles attached to his back with harnesses that were to be considered wings. A crowd of children down below, a mixture of siblings, cousins, and friends, watched as he fussed with the configuration, trying to shift the blanket back into place as the breeze ruffled it. Another girl, about 14 years old, came around the building. "He's coming," the cousin warned young Perrin. He knew by the inflection of her voice that she meant trouble was coming. Peering over the edge, he saw the white hair jogging to the schoolhouse. Young Per felt torn. On the one hand, he wanted to get this over with before any adults arrived. They always complicated matters, pointing out the flaws in his plans and telling him he didn't know enough to do what he wanted to attempt. On the other hand, he wanted Pugga to see this. There were times young Perrin was sure he saw veiled approval, or maybe even jealousy, in his grandfather's eyes. Suddenly, there he was, in front of the schoolhouse, large, muscular, and now striding purposefully despite being 72 years old. As he reached the knot of children, he stopped, put his hands on his waist, and his eyes interrogated each of them. One of the boys pointed upward. "There, Pugga." The older man didn't move his head, but shifted his gaze to the roof. What he saw made his jaw clench. "You see these white hairs?" he yelled, pointing to his head. "You've given me each one of them. What are you planning now, young Per?" "Pugga," young Per called down. "I know what you're thinking, but this will work." He spread out his arms. "I'm going to fly," he announced grandly. His grandfather shook his head in disbelief. "Boy, where do you get these ideas?" "Now, Pugga, trust me with this one. I've thought this through." His grandfather folded his arms. "Since when do you ever think things through?" Young Per scoffed at the insult. "All the time. Now, I wanted to see what it would be like to jump from this height." "Why?" Young Per, surprised by the question, held out his hands as if the answer was obvious. "It just seems like an interesting thing to do." His grandfather exhaled heavily. "So, you think it'll be interesting to crash to the ground and break something you have yet to break?" "I'm not going to crash to the ground," young Per said. "I'm going to float down." He flapped his arms experimentally. "This will work." "If it were that simple to fly," his grandfather said, "don't you think others would have done it by now?" Young Per knew this strategy. Logic. He had a way to counter it. "Pugga, sometimes people are just too cowardly to do the obvious. I've researched this, and no one's tried this before, probably because they were afraid of falling." "Maybe people have tried this," Pugga acknowledged, "but didn't survive to write about it. Others just found their flattened bodies on the ground, mysteriously covered in blankets, and had no idea what caused their demise. In all of your research, did you look up unexplained deaths in Salem?" Some of his grandsons snickered. Some of his granddaughters wrung their hands in worry. "Oh, ha, young Per called down at him. "Besides," Pugga went on, "the Creator didn't design us to fly." Ah, logic again. Young Per held up a finger. But Pugga, the creator, also didn't design us to move from one place to another quickly. But that's why he gave us horses. I'm just doing what Mugga says. Test everything. Test what you believe. Test what you doubt. Find out the truth of all things yourself. Perrin closed his eyes, knowing full well what was going to come next. Well, Pugga, I doubt that the Creator did not want us to fly. Therefore, I will test what I doubt. Young Per could read the cynicism in his grandfather's expression. You can learn from others' mistakes, young Per. Remember when Mr. Hint fell from his barn roof? But did he have blanket wings? Young Per asked knowingly. Let me rephrase this, Perrin said, quietly growling as he always did when he was about to lose an argument. The Creator did not design you to fly off the roof today. And where's that written? Young Per countered. It's nature's law, his grandfather called up to him. All things fall to the ground. Law number 1. Look, your mother's on her way. He glanced to the side of the building to make sure she hadn't already arrived, but everyone would have heard her if she had. Now, come down. Young Per grinned. That's what I've been planning to do. And he fluffed out his wings. Not that way, boy, Perrin bellowed. Pugga, didn't you ever wonder what it'd feel like to fly? Young Per called down. Briefly, Perrin admitted. But then I worry about what it'd feel like when I hit the ground. See, there you go again, assuming my failure. But Pugga, what if I don't hit the ground? What if I can defy nature's law? And even if I don't, won't the thrill of falling be worth the pain at the bottom? Perrin threw his hands in the air. Just how many times do you have to hurt yourself to answer that question, young Per? Look, I understand your desire for something exciting. So if you want something to thrill you, come down here the proper way and... Perrin looked around, trying to find an enticing diversion. What, race you, old man? Young Per sniggered. Perrin took a deep breath. His grandson had been teasing him about their last race for years now. Young Per was almost 13 then, and already larger than his father. Perrin was 67 and thought he was still quite fast for his age, so he bragged to the family he was about to humble his boastful grandson. It was Perrin who was humbled, or rather humiliated, in front of the entire family, who cheered his grandson's sizable victory. Not even Uncle Shem had any sympathy for him. Perrin folded his arms and subtly felt his ample bicep. Come down here and take me on. You have yet to beat me in an arm wrestle. Today may be your lucky day. His 12-year-old grandson looked up at Perrin and scowled. An arm wrestle? Oh, Pugga, that's not thrilling. Hush, Hogel. Young Per wagged a finger at his grandfather. Not today, old man. I'll beat you another time. Perrin's mouth dropped open in feigned dismay. Again with the old man? Get down here, boy. Let's see who the old man is. His 7-year-old granddaughter, standing next to him, grabbed his hand and squeezed it. You are an old man, Pugga, but that's all right. I like your white hair. He bent over and gave her a quick kiss on the head. It's only starting to go white. But thank you, Mora. Always good to be reminded. He glanced back up at young Per. Look, my afternoon's free, so let's come up with something else exciting, all right? Another young man rounded the schoolhouse. Cephas was the same age as his cousin, and called up a warning when he saw him on the roof. Young Per, Aunt Lilla's on her way. Better get down now. All right, Cephas, young Per said, with as much sincerity as he could muster for his ever-obedient, ever-perfect cousin. For you, I will. He backed up along the roofline, and Cephas and Perrin exchanged looks of relief. Until they heard the running. They didn't have time to shout, No! Young Per was the first human on that sphere to feel the sensation of flying, and it was as glorious as he knew it would be. It made his heart quicken, then stop, and amazing joy as the air rushed past his face. Then he felt the sensation of falling. He wasn't the first human to experience that, but it was still fantastic in its own right. Then toppling. All right, maybe not so good. Then the sensation of hearing his mother scream. Yeah, getting worse. Then the sensation of impact, then pain, then darkness and silence. When young Pear's eyes opened, he looked into the face of his mother. She was red, puffier than usual, and her dark blonde hair was falling untidily out of its bun. She cried out as she looked up to the ceiling, "Thank the Creator!" "You don't have to yell, Lilla," said someone behind her. "Yes, I do!" Lilla exclaimed, immediately smothering young Pear's face with sloppy kisses. "It's the only kiss. Way that kiss. My boy, kiss, kiss. Here's me." He'd need a washing rag later. Behind his mother hovered his grandmother. Mari Shin looked slightly disheveled, her shoulder-length gray hair dislodged from where it was usually tucked behind her ears. Something about her appearance was wearier than usual. "Say something," she prompted him, not entirely convinced he was all right. "Hello, my name is Young Pear," he said a bit groggily. "And you seem like a charming young woman. What's your name, miss?" Mari rolled her eyes. "Yes, he's fine," she exhaled as if she hadn't breathed properly in hours. "Young Pear, you're being preserved, but for what, I can't imagine." Mugga leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," she whispered fiercely in his ear. Young Pear tried to smile at her often repeated admonition, but every muscle protested in pain. He tried to sit up and realized he was in his bedroom. Wait, I'm at home? Another face came over, belonging to his cousin, Boskos Zenas. At the same stature as his father, Shamit, age 22, Boskos also had light brown hair and blue eyes, which now peered deeply and analytically at young Pear. He picked up young Pear's wrist, felt his pulse, and nodded in satisfaction. "What, I get only the doctor's apprentice now?" young Pear asked. Boskos ignored that and looked into each of his dark brown eyes. "How do you feel? Your left shoulder is bruised where you landed on it. Try rotating it." Young Pear did so and winced in pain. Not dislocated this time." "Didn't think so," Boskos said, peering closer and closer into his left eye as young Pear tried to lean away from him. "My sister said you bounced when you hit the ground. Are your ribs all right? Your breathing's been clear and we didn't feel any breaks." Young Pear took an experimental breath. "Nothing feels broken this time." "Good." His cousin smiled and stood up. "I'll tell Dr. Toon he doesn't need to come by again until morning. I can keep an eye on you until then. You need to stay in bed for the next few days if you want to be ready for next week." "Sure, boss," young Pear said in his best sincere voice. Boskos pointed at him. "I mean it." Young Pear sighed while his mother resumed her fussing over him, straightening his blankets and brushing aside his black hair. Boskos turned to the older man, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. "Uncle Perrin, make sure he stays in bed." Perrin nodded. "I'll do my best, Dr. Zenas." "I'm not a doctor yet. A few more tests still to pass." "For as much practice as you've had over the years with this family, I think they should grant you your certificate already." Boskos grinned. "That's what I keep telling them." Perrin caught his arm as Boskos started to leave. "After the doctor, stop by and talk to your father," he said in a low voice. He was worried. "I was already planning on it." Boskos headed down the hall, calling, "Uncle Pedo, he's awake." Young Pear automatically stiffened, knowing what was to come, but every muscle ached as he did so. Almost instantly, his father appeared at the door. Unlike young Pear, Pedo was of average height, with light brown hair and pale gray eyes, but his features were the same as Perrin's, which meant the same as young Pear's. He sat down gingerly next to his son, and when he spoke, his tone was tight. "The doctor and Bosco said they can't see anything that will be permanently damaged, except maybe your head." He ignored the unnecessary grooming of his wife, who was mopping young Pear's head with an overly damp cloth. "And hopefully your pride, but I have my doubts about that, son." He gripped young Pear's hand, which felt fine until his father squeezed it. "I'm just so grateful you've come back to us again," Peto said earnestly. "We've been praying for you since yesterday afternoon, you know." That surprised young Pear. "So, how long have I been here?" He heard his grandfather answer. "It's nearly dinner time now, so since yesterday, when your father, Uncle Shem, and I carried you home after your bird-brained idea. You're getting heavier, boy. I remember when I could carry your limp body home all by myself." Perrin's face was stern, but he couldn't hide the relief in his eyes. "Oh," young Pear said. Making sure they all heard the twinge of regret, he added, "I'm sorry about that. I guess it explains why I'm hungry now, though." And he looked pleadingly at his mother. "He's hungry," she cried. "Oh, it's been a cold gravy day, I'll tell you." Young Pear knew how bad a situation was, based on the worst meal his mother could think of. The nastier the items, the more worried she'd been. "A cold gravy day with moldy biscuits and floppy pickles and runny potatoes." "Didn't he say he was hungry, Lilla?" Perrin mercifully interrupted his daughter-in-law before she detailed the saddest dinner in Salem. It was time to make her son the best dinner, as she always did. "That's right," she said happily. "I knew I was right to make those first peaches into pie." She kissed him and leaped to her feet to rush down the long hall to the kitchen. But Peto wasn't smiling. "And that's all you have to say, young Pear? I'm sorry, I'm hungry?" "Peto," Mari said calmly. "No, Mother, he's old enough to understand." He looked intently at his son. "Whatever you do affects everyone around you. Last night your siblings and cousins were sure this time you wouldn't come back to us. Mora cried herself to sleep. Lori even came over to keep watch last night. Uncle Shem and Aunt Calla have been here twice. Cephas did your chores this morning. Young Pear, whenever you do something interesting, everyone suffers. Can you please try to understand that?" He'd heard this lecture before, and while he was lying in bed, too. He looked past his father and counted the wood planks on the ceiling, as he usually did. Eventually, he came up with, "It's not like I'm trying to hurt other people." He really didn't know what else they wanted him to say. "Young Pear," Peto put his hand lightly on his son's broad chest, "I worry about you immensely. I don't want to lose you. I couldn't bear for something truly terrible to happen to you. Can you understand that?" Young Pear nodded, but kept his gaze on the ceiling. Nothing truly terrible had happened to him before. Why should it in the future? He always woke up again, sometimes in casts, sometimes with stitches, but in a few days or weeks or moons, he was fine again. Peto sighed as if wanting to say something else. Instead, he squeezed his son's hand again. "I'll go tell everyone else how you're faring, although I'm sure your mother has already sung it to the neighborhood." Peto looked at his parents, since his son wouldn't meet his eyes. They both gave him a quick nod. That usually meant he was expecting them to say something profound in a few minutes, right after he left. Peto patted young Pear's chest. "Remember that I love you, son." He stood up and left the room. Pugga and Mugga looked at each other, then at their 12th grandchild, who had let his gaze drop to count the boards on the wall. Young Pear wondered who'd go first. "Do you understand how much he worries about you, young Pear?" Mugga started because she usually went first. "Yes," he said dully. Giving them the answers they wanted made the speeches go by faster. He'd learned that when he was 14 and had run out of the house into a small twister in the pasture to see just how powerful it was. You would have thought by his family's overreaction that it had thrown him further than a few dozen paces. He gets frustrated because he knows no other way to tell you how much he fears for you, Murray continued. It's not really his way to smother you in kisses like your mother does. Young Pear didn't have enough strength to keep the corners of his mouth from twitching upward at that. She noticed. Nor would you want that, I'm sure. Murray smiled broadly. You have an exuberant spirit, my sweet boy. Young Pear blushed at his grandmother's nickname for him. You have the capacity to accomplish great things, but only if you discipline yourself. You need to find ways to harness your impulses. Use them in productive ways. He sighed and started counting the boards again. He'd heard this speech before, several times. And Murray knew it too. She stopped and leaned over to kiss him again on the cheek. I love you, young Pear, no matter what you do, even when you manipulate my words for your own purposes. I would never have told you to test nature's law by throwing yourself off a building. That's not what I was trying. Oh, never mind, he mumbled. Murray patted his cheek. I'll go check on your dinner. Make sure the gravy's warmed up. Young Pear watched her out of the corner of his eye. She was giving her husband an "it's your turn" look as she left. Perrin nodded at her, but didn't move from his spot against the wall. Instead, he watched for a while until his namesake finally looked over at him. It's your turn, isn't it, Pugga? Young Pear asked his grandfather. He usually began with, I'm concerned about you, son. Let's talk. Young Pear assumed it was a leftover phrase from his years in the army. But Perrin was going for a new approach, because today he only shrugged and said, Do you need anything? No, Pugga. All right, then. Perrin pushed off the wall and came over to his grandson. For lack of something better to do, he ruffled up young Pear's thick black hair. Young Pear wondered if he was envious. Supposedly, Pugga's hair used to look like that. Everything about young Perrin Shin, from his towering height to his massive build to his dark brown eyes, was a copy of his grandfather, or so he was told. You need to rest up. The trail marking trip is in less than a week. Your grandmother in Norden is expecting our visit, and if I don't bring her grandson in good health, she just might sit on me. Young Pear couldn't hide the smile that surfaced to his lips. Grandma Travato was a hefty woman. I'll come back and check on you later. If you need anything, remember you can always ask for me. He patted young Pear's cheek and headed for the door. His littlest sister Mora bounded in, glanced up at Pugga to make sure he was on his way out, then rushed to young Pear's side. You're awake, she chirped. Yes, obviously, he said to the 7-year-old. While he appreciated how she idolized him, it was also quite annoying at times, except when she was useful. Sorry I got the wrong blankets for you, she said, her face the picture of disappointment. I bet it would have worked with better blankets. He patted her hand, which sat tentatively on his bed. That's all right. I'm not sure that was the problem, but I appreciate you sneaking them out of the house for me. Something still worried her, though. So you're not mad at me? I didn't make a mistake? No, not mad. You did just fine. And I didn't tell on you, she blurted. I don't know who did, but I kept your secret good, didn't I? Yes, you did, he assured her. You've proven you can be part of my team, he whispered the last words, and she beamed like the sunshine. He needed an innocent spy and accomplice, and so far Mora was showing her worth. Sometimes the adults in the family became too curious as to what young Pear was up to, and questioned his every movement, request, and effort to sneak off with something tucked under his shirt. But little Mora? She could charm the claws off a kitten. When I'm healed and ready for my next project, you'll be my #1 helper." She couldn't have grinned any wider, showing front teeth which were hopelessly crooked. "All right, young pair," and she put her finger to her lips, just as he had when he tasked her to sneak him out blankets for his wings. He winked at her and added an eyebrow raise, as if they were conspiring on the greatest adventure Salem had ever seen. "Now, go see if Mama saved me any extra pie. If she hasn't, slip one into the cabinet for me, all right, my #1 helper?" Her hand did something odd around her forehead, until young Pear realized she was trying to salute. But since they didn't have an army in Salem, and Maura had met only a handful of former soldiers who never saluted, at least they never did twice, since General Shin despised it when any refugees tried to salute him, her attempt was bizarre at best. Thank you for that," he said to her. "Dismissed," he said, more as a question than an order. But when he said, "Check on that pie," it was clearly an order. Maura grinned and bobbed out of the bedroom, just as a slew of siblings and cousins came flooding in. The flow of family visitors continued as young Pear ate his dinner and second helpings in his bed. Mari sat in the gathering room, with an eye on the hallway to see who went in and out, and if her most troublesome grandson needed anything. But mostly she was watching for, there he was, with his arms full of chopped wood for her and Perrin's fire. Cephas Brighter, only 3 days older than young Pear, nodded once to Mari before heading down to her wing to deliver the wood. He returned a moment later and made his way through chatting relatives to check on his cousin, young Pear. Mari caught Perrin's eye across the room, but already he was striding to the hallway and his namesake's bedroom. The boys' relationship was an application in natural laws, Mari had decided some years ago. For as much as Cephas tried to pull toward restraint and care, young Pear provided an equal, and often greater, opposing push for recklessness. At times Mari wondered if there hadn't been some divine appointment as to who was in each family. The Creator must have known someone like young Pear would need someone like Cephas to provide some balance. Although they'd been best friends when they were little, they became opposites as they aged, and now that they were nearly 18, they could barely abide being in the same room. Still, Cephas seemed intent on making an effort, likely because young Pear was too sore to put up much of a physical fight. Cephas went into the bedroom only after a younger brother bounded out of it, and Mari and Perrin tiptoed up to the door to listen. "How are you feeling?" Cephas asked amiably. "Fine," was the short response. An uncomfortable silence followed, then, "Don't worry about your chores for the next few days. I've got them covered." "Don't bother." Young Pear's response was crisp. "I can do them." Cephas scoffed, likely trying to sound light-hearted, but it wasn't light enough. "No, you can't. Bosco said you need to rest at least a week, and I imagine you can barely walk. How can you take care of the morning firewood?" In his tone, Mari could hear his genuine concern, but that wasn't what young Pear heard. "Cephas, just do your own chores. I don't need your charity." "Charity? It's not charity," Cephas insisted. "I'm doing it for Mugga. She needs the firewood." "I can take care of my Mugga. You stay at your house, I'll stay at mine," said young Pear firmly. "Take care of your own family." "Mugga is my family, and so are you, young Pear." "And how often do you regret that?" Cephas groaned, all diplomacy flying out the window. "What, this again? That was 3 years ago, and I never said I regretted you being in my family. All I said to the lumberjacks rescuing you was that I was sorry they had to come out all that way. Honestly, young Pear, you only hear what you want to hear, don't you?" "What I want to hear," young Pear said, in a measured yet hostile tone, is you not lecturing me anymore. That's what my parents and grandparents are for. Well, maybe if you listen to them once in a while, I wouldn't have to tell you the same things. Mari and Perrin exchanged the same look, and Perrin cleared his throat loudly to announce his presence before pushing open the door. Time for family prayer, boys. Cephas stormed out, apologetically patting his grandmother's arm as he passed, and stomped to the bustling gathering room. Mari peered into the bedroom to see Perrin hefting young Pear, who insisted on getting out of bed. Even now, Perrin was still so strong, yet so gentle. He readily hoisted his groaning grandson, who matched him in height and bulk, and put a steadying arm around him. After a moment, young Pear nodded that he wasn't about to topple over, and the two of them slowly lumbered to the door. Mari stepped back, knowing her grandson wouldn't want her to see him so frail. And, sure enough, once they finally made it to the hall, he shrugged off his grandfather and shuffled on his own down the long hallway. He had a point to prove to his cousin Cephas, although it was a stupid point. Mari caught her husband's arm. I don't think it'd be a good idea to ask either of them to offer the prayer tonight, she whispered. We don't need another, please bless that my cousin will realize he's a big dummy prayer tonight. Perrin smiled, as he likely remembered the prayer recently offered by Mora Shim after she'd had an argument with young Shem Brighter. Agreed. Tonight is my night anyway. Perrin kept that family prayer full of civility and gratitude for the welfare of their family. It was nights like that when Mari thought maybe he had learned something in his negotiation classes years ago. But it was more likely the tutelage of the Creator over the years that had turned Perrin into the remarkable man that he was now. He had a way of soothing every conflict, of understanding each grandchild, and of always being at the right place and at the right time. I know I've asked this of you before, but any suggestions? Peto said as he looked at his mug and slowly turned it in his hands. His brown hair seemed to have added a few more gray strands around his temples since yesterday afternoon. They complemented the lines that were etching deeper around his eyes. He sat at the eating room table with Dec and Perrin. The younger children were asleep, the older children were in their rooms in the western wing, and the women were talking in the gathering room, leaving them alone. Dec, sitting next to him at the large table, slowly shook his head. Young Pear is an interesting young man. Peto stopped turning the mug, looked at Dec, and said, Well, that was helpful. Dec smiled faintly. I don't know how else to put it. He's not a bad boy. It's as if he's gotten into a batch of bad feed and can't get it out of his system. If he were a bull, I might have more helpful ideas. None of my sons have been quite as lively as young Pear, yet. Perrin chuckled softly from across the table. If young Pear were Dec's bull, there'd be a way to steer him to be calmer, I'm sure. Oh, I'm not suggesting that, Dec protested, while his father-in-law and brother-in-law smiled. I know you're not, Peto assured him. It's just that Lila and I don't know what more to do for him. We run from one disaster of his to another, praying he'll survive long enough to learn some sense. Of our 13 children, we spend most of our time on him. He sighed miserably. I just worry how it's all going to end, he whispered. Perrin leaned forward. You can't think like that, about the end, whatever it may be. You can't assume it'll be for the worst. Miracles still happen all the time. You, of all people, know that. Peto nodded feebly, staring at his mug again. I know all about miracles, and I've been praying for one for young Pear. But the Creator can't force anyone to do anything. He looked up briefly. It would be a lot easier if he could. Dec nodded in understanding. Some of his brood of 12 had given him and Jatsi many moments of fear and grief, and with young Shem only 7 years old, there was undoubtedly many more years of worry to come. His children didn't cause his hair to go gray, they just caused it to go. By the time his youngest would be a father, Dek was sure he'd be completely bald. "So, Pedo," Dek said gently, "what would Rector Shin say to a discouraged father?" Pedo scoffed. "Has anyone in our congregation had a son like mine? It's true. The rector's children are always the worst." "But who else in Salem," Perrin began, "besides a rector who grew up in the world, could have enough patience to handle such a spirited boy? What other grandparents have had so much experience with reckless teenagers? Who else here could possibly help rein in this one before he does permanent damage? Can you imagine if young Pear was an edge, or whatever they're calling it now?" Dek shuddered. Pedo remained unmoved. "This family was prepared to be sent young Pear," Perrin assured his son. "The Creator knows you're the best man in Salem to be his father." Pedo only shrugged. "I remember Rector Shin giving a talk not too long ago about choices," Perrin said, looking off in the distance. His son looked down at the table and smiled dimly. "I believe he said we all make our choices, we all live with the consequences, we all mess up. We learn from the mistakes, hopefully, and make better choices the next time around. Some people take a lot longer to learn a lesson than others, but that's why we're here, working the test, enduring to the end. And so we sit around the table, patiently hoping we see the boy get some sense knocked into him." Pedo examined his mug. "I didn't put it exactly like that, but at least I know someone picked up on the general idea." In a whisper he asked, "What have I done wrong with him?" "Nothing, Pedo," Dek said earnestly. "You have 5 older children who've matured very well, and they know their Creator. You have," he counted quickly, 7 more children who love you and Lila, and show none of the wild tendencies of young Pear. Some are watching him, that's true." Dek's eyebrows furrowed in worry. "And some of mine watch him too. But I have to believe that everything he does is because of who he is, not what you have done, right or wrong." Pedo looked to his father for a second opinion. "I agree. You're a good father, Pedo. Better than I was. Just love him, and make sure he knows you do. But I do have another suggestion. Ask the guide what he thinks about you and young Pear. He can help you understand what the Creator wants you to know. I think you're too close to the problem to see it clearly." Nodding in reluctant agreement, Pedo said, "Huldah was at the schoolhouse yesterday, and she was quite the informant for her father. I'm sure Shem's just waiting for me to ask his opinion, but he won't share it unless I ask." Perrin had a look on his face that suggested he had one more thought. "What is it, Perrin?" Dek asked. He hesitated before saying, "I'm only going to say this once, because I know neither of you would approve, but I've thought this for quite some time." He paused. "Well," prodded Pedo. "With his daring, his ingenuity, and his charisma," Perrin said, "young Pear would have been a great army officer. He could have been the next General Shin." Pedo and Dek stared at him before turning to each other. Perrin winced with worry, but his boys howled with laughter. "He'd destroy Idemia," Dek declared. "Then he'd destroy Salem," Pedo added. Perrin shrugged. "It's just that with all the mandatory discipline, the outlets for pent-up energy." "You mean the forced regulations and trained violence?" Pedo restated sharply. "Yes," Perrin conceded. "You could put it that way. I think he would have responded to the kind of life the Army affords, or rather, afforded when I was his age. I can't imagine what the state of the Army of Idemia might be now, or the factions. It doesn't matter, though, he ended quietly. Perrin, he's already a member of your army, Dec offered. Perrin scoffed at that. Even Mari's a member, and it's only a militia. There's a big difference between a standing army and a bunch of farmers, children, and great-grandparents with pitchforks. Dec looked a little hurt. I'm sorry, Dec. You know what I mean, don't you? Dec nodded. I do. I just didn't realize until now you missed the army so much. Perrin looked like he'd been stabbed with a pitchfork by a rancher. I don't, he stammered. Oh, come on, General. Not even a little? Peto asked him, suspicious. Perrin searched for the right words while his sons eyed him warily. There are aspects that I miss, but there's far more that I'm glad I'm rid of. I wouldn't trade my life here with you boys and your families for any command. Truly, I have my own little army right here. Peto and Dec exchanged doubtful glances. Uh-huh, Peto said. But aren't there days when it was simpler to rally hundreds of men to arms than to get the entire family gathered together for one of your nightly roll calls? Dec laughed while Perrin objected good-naturedly to what he insisted on as a family tradition, but the rest of the family regarded as a joke. Roll call is important. What if one of your little ones has wandered off and no one noticed until bedtime? That's never happened, Peto countered. Because of roll call, Perrin insisted. It even helped Selima find Lek once. Remember, Dec? Lek wasn't missing, Perrin. He was just avoiding you, Dec declared. You scared him to death with your little grandfatherly talk right before their wedding. As if that poor man wasn't quiet and shy enough as it is. You never gave me that talk. He still won't tell me or Shem what you said, and it's been 6 years. Peto and Dec laughed as Perrin sighed. Well, we get along fine now, right? All of my married granddaughters are treated very well by their husbands, aren't they? Perrin turned to Peto. Peto pointed at his father. Lori Sam dared to talk to you again only after I told him about Lila's Papa Pear nickname. You big old soft bear, you, he teased. Fortunately, Jory's fiancé-to-be was there at the time, so Khan was prepared for your little chat. Perrin tried to look stern as Dec and Peto laughed again, but he was glad to see them lighter again, now that the latest storm had passed. Eventually, Peto sighed. Well, at least young Pear has the General as a grandfather, and 2 uncles who are always neutral parties. Someone else he can turn to when he and I can't seem to connect. Will you promise me, if either of you sees something we should be doing differently with young Pear, please tell me? Ah, Peto. Perrin sighed and ran a hand through his whitening hair. That's what our wives are for. And that's the end of chapter 1. Thank you.